This is a virtual reading of Conspirators, To Each His Own Agenda by Matt Gupta.
Chapter 51. The Breached Wall. The army flooded into the breach. The lieutenant shouted out for the pylon, and for a moment the breach was flooded with throwing spears. The front lines of the army was impaled on a wall of spears, and the broken bodies collapsed into the opening. But the dead were quickly replaced, and the lines met. Dervin watched from the wall and sighed. The attack was in full force now. Just as the Lord Warden had predicted, when the army started to move up their siege towers, they stopped their bombardment. "Trebuchets," Dervin shouted. "Fire at will. Target the towers." The artillery answered, pouring out fire faster than ever. Their aim was haphazard at best, but it did not matter. The attacking army was so numerous that no matter where they hit an enemy. The attacking men manning the catapults could do nothing to protect their comrades, not without risking hitting their own towers. But even with all of the destruction to the army, they were bringing forth their battering ram. "Brace the gate," Dervin shouted to the people in the gate courtyard. "Pelum," he shouted, "take down the ram." The soldiers answered in full. Spears and rocks were hurled at the ram and the men defending it. But the ranger companies in the army comprised a major part of the force, so their arrows drowned out the missiles from the walls. The majority of the arrows bounced uselessly off the wall, but the few that met their mark tore through the lines. Men fell from the walls. If the arrows didn't kill them, the fall did. The siege towers met the wall. There were men already in place on the bottom of it, and they began soaking themselves in water. The aim was to protect the soldiers from catching fire and burning the tower itself. Once drenched, they began to ascend through the tower. It was only when the tower was in position and the men ready that the ramps were deployed. Dervin had his men readied by the time the towers were deployed. Clay urns of black pitch and other flammable objects were being readied for throwing. The ramp crashed down onto the wall, crushing the crenellations under it, and the men rushed forward. "Fire!" Dervin shouted, and all of the men threw their pitch and their torches. Despite the efforts of the men to prevent it, the men were ignited, and the tower quickly followed. But the main efforts were only on singular towers. The others reached the walls, and men came pouring out. Dervin saw this, but his attention was focused on the outer edges of the walls, where there were no defenders. He couldn't do anything about it, though. The men that emerged from the towers to board the walls were terrifying. These were distant Scottish mercenaries of Securi, famed for their siege tactics and ability to take the walls of any stronghold. Their reputation was well earned. The first man hit the battlements with a stone-breaking thud and swung his battle axe in a wide arc that cut down 4 men in a single blow. After the second and third men landed, men were already moving back in terror. The Citadel guardsmen showed aptitude at fighting them, however, as their spearcraft was designed for fighting foes with overly large weaponry and heavy swings. Several of the axemen were brought down, but more kept on flooding onto the wall. Dervin watched the events occur, with an eyebrow raised. Knowing that the end was coming averted his panic somehow. But when he saw the rams approaching, that left him. "Brace the gate," he chorused behind him again, to the men on ground level. "Ready the murder holes." The pots that contained the murder were rolled forward on their frames. Unlike the stories and lessons on the subject, boiling oil was simply too expensive to pour down the cavities that lined the gatehouse and water was always a premium during a siege. So Dervan had ordered that every public house empty their latrines and have the contents boiled. The stench had been horrendous, but once the lids were on the pots, the smell had abated. Now at the gates, and at various parts of the walls, the red-hot brass pots of urine and dung, both beast and man, were being readied to be dropped on the unlucky men below them. With a downward thrust of his arm, he signalled the pots to be spilled forth. The stench was horrific, and the screams were worse as the putrid muck burned through the men's armour and flesh. The ram had rolled up to the gate and began to swing the heavy wooden and iron shaft into the wooden door. The first impact did little in terms of damage. The door was made of the most impenetrable wood, while being surprisingly easy to open from the inside. The second impact struck the gate enough to rattle the chains of the locking mechanism, as did the third and fourth. This could go on for hours, but Dervan couldn't wait for that. The jars of pitch and flaming brands were brought forth and thrown over the gatehouse at the ram. It took several impacts to soak the wood enough to ignite it, but eventually they managed it. The ram burst into flames and the men abandoned it to save themselves being scalded. Some were unlucky and met their deaths in flames. The Lord Warden had been correct. When the ram was destroyed at the gate, they couldn't make any more assaults on it. In the end, the other rams made their way to the wall and were starting to attack the foundation of the wall itself. It was a pointless endeavour. This wasn't the result of a lack of discipline. The amount of trouble it would take to turn them around and move them out of the way was not worth it. At least, where they were, they could be used as cover against the oils and missiles. It provided little comfort, however. The men on the wall were being overwhelmed, and the wall was all but lost, with the fight expanding onto the adjacent sections. Dervan's forces were running thinner and thinner as the battle progressed. Though they were inflicting huge casualties on the attacking army, the fact that the army was inside the walls was devastating the defenders' morale. They were effectively surrounded, and the lines were breaking down. Their numbers meant that the battle went on for a good hour. With the gate somewhat secure, Dervan ordered the men guarding the gate to reinforce the breach. The lines were holding better than he thought they would, but inch by inch they were getting pushed back. The arrival of another 1,000 men was a welcome relief, and for a moment the forces invading were outflanked, but they were much more disciplined than the raw recruits, and it was easy for the attackers to simply adjust their formation and face their new threat. "No more," Dervan grunted, stabbing his spear into a man on a ladder. It had the ideal effect. The man's dead body collapsed on top of the others and knocked everyone off. It was a huge drop, so all of them were killed. "Sir," a bloodied soldier shouted over the chaos of battle, "the wall is lost." "I can see that," Dervan retorted. "Pull everybody back. Fall back to the second wall." The soldier nodded, but an axe buried itself in his armoured helmet, and the man fell dead to the floor. Dervan deflected the next axe blow and stabbed the huge man in the neck. "Fall back," he shouted, his voice not carrying too far. But the men near him heard it. They began to rush at the stairway to the ground floor, and a scrum formed at the doorway. The forces attacking the wall took advantage of this and took the wall for themselves, cutting down those who were less fortunate to be at the back of the scrum. The panic forced the doorways to the towers in, and the defenders made it down the stairs. As the first men met the ground, the attackers on the wall began to throw the men from the top. Dervan had the grace to let his men through first, but he was quickly overwhelmed, and he was one of the poor men who was thrown from the wall. He landed hard against a broken piece of rock, and his armour compacted. A citadel guardsman rushed over to him and pulled him up. "Make way," he shouted, as he pulled him through the panicked crowd. Felthor watched his men flood into the city. He had taken a position somewhere between the breach and the gatehouse. Even over the din, he could hear soldiers' cries to fall back. "All right," he said to himself. "Enough for one day." "But my lord," his hornblower blurted, "we have them on the run." "Yes," Felthor agreed, "but I have a promise to keep. We wait for Alistair's army to arrive, secure the outer wall, and prepare for counterattack." "Yes, General." The hornblower immediately signalled the army to stop the attack. Though the troops were disciplined, it still took them a while to obey the command. Several miles away, Alistair took a swig of his drink. It wasn't wine like the others had, but spiced water, designed to taste so foul it would wake him from any stupor. It had caused something of a stir with his men, who used the amount of wine they drank as a symbol of their manliness, but Alistair needed to keep his wits about him. They were taking the coastal road from the harbour city. The army had taken a break from a full day's march. They could see from their camp the orange glow from the flames. While most of the army relaxed and unwound with the following Hor caravans, Alistair and his commanders were watching the glow and smoke. "What do you think?" Pillimore grumbled. "Too small to be the whole city." "If the entire city was on fire, the whole world would know," Baranis agreed. "Falthor has instructions to not take the city without us." Alistair's voice was stern. Taking a city that big with only his forces would be impossible. Baranis narrowed her eyes, regardless of orders. "I agree," Lord Bane nodded solemnly. "Not even the greatest of all leaders can cover every street in that city without the aid of a world-standing army." "Falthor isn't stupid," Baranis chewed her lip. "I'm more worried about his men. The city might prove too tempting a treasure for even Falthor to keep them in line." The others evidently hadn't thought of this. "Should we pull up camp and march through the night?" Bane asked the group at large. Alistair shook his head. "The men have too much wine in their stomach and women's cunt in their hands. They won't thank us for it, and given the fine line we walk on this campaign, we need the army on our side. Does that rule out a forced march in the morning?" Pillimore smirked hopefully. "No." Alistair turned his head very slightly to look at Pillimore, and then turned to look back at the glow. "Forced march in the morning. We'll just have to give them incentive to not turn on us for it." "Money often works," Baranis shrugged. "Man's instincts usually refer to either that or what's in between a woman's legs." "They do say the whores of the capital are like a polished jewel," Pillimore agreed. "I think we'll go with money," Alistair smiled despite himself, "though the inside of a warm woman works also." He glanced at Baranis, who met his gaze with an amused disgust. "Speaking of which," Pillimore clapped his hands, "I have 4 women who are growing colder by the minute." Alistair laughed again. "Go to your whores, my friends. Even you," he added to Baranis. "I have my whores as much as any man," Baranis retorted. "Those women pleasure me in a way that no man ever could." "You are a woman of many surprises," Pillimore smiled. For the first time, he seemed to be speaking to her with respect. "I would be glad to show you what a real man can do." "You tried that before," Baranis taunted, pushing out her chest to add to the effect. "How is that hand of yours?" Pillimore couldn't help but flex his hand, which was still bandaged slightly. He huffed to cover his embarrassment. "You're too small for me anyway. I'd probably split you open." Baranis seemed slightly baited by this and intrigued by the idea, but her Amazonian nature won over. "I had 3 men in me once. You," she gave him an uninterested look, "wouldn't stand a chance against me." Everyone scoffed except Alistair, who had taken another swig of his foul concoction. Once she left, he nodded to Pillimore. Don't be too hasty to disbelieve her. I've sampled her talent. It's not too far a stretch. Go, he shooed them away. The whores won't fuck themselves. They will if we pay them too, Pillimore smirked as he left. The army pulled up stakes early that morning. As per usual military procedure, the camp and its fortifications were burned so that bandits couldn't use it as a base for their illicit activities. The army was moving at practically double time, but the drummers were drumming an invigorating beat, which made the rhythm more bearable for the troops. They left their baggage train behind them with a token force, and the men marched with only their weapons and armor. The flames had died out over the mountains, but the sky was black from the smoke. The day had quickly turned to midday as the army marched on. When the road turned them towards the mountain, and they began their northern march, a scout came riding back towards them at full gallop. "My prince," the scout cried out, upon seeing Alistair and taking to a hill to the side of the road. "Let him through," Alistair commanded to his knights. The scout approached Alistair and bowed on his horse. "What is it, soldier?" "The Fountain Legion," the scout panted. "They're on the march." "How far away?" Pillimore barked. "They're on my tail." The scout pointed vaguely behind him. "We watch them from the mountain cliff. Their speed is unlike anything I have seen." "My father's limp sweating cock," Pillimore cursed. "If the Legion sets upon us, we will meet our deaths." "Sound the bells," Alistair shouted. "Get to your positions. Baranis." But Baranis had already left to rally her troop. "Knights," Alistair shouted, "with me." The army took little under an hour to organize into its formations. It left little time for waiting. They had had to take up formation in the worst place to meet a hoplite force, a narrow causeway in between a river and a cliff edge. The scout was right. The Legion was marching almost as quickly as if at a full sprint. The dust cloud could be easily seen on the horizon, and before long they could hear the rapid marching. "Steady, men," Pillimore shouted. "Fear not these boy lovers in their white dresses. We are true men, and we are here to fight. Let's get to fucking them up." The army behind him let out a roar of approval and banged their shields together, falling into their attack postures. "Get the slingers ready," Alistair ordered. One of his soldiers rushed back to the rear lines to obey. The Fountain Legion marched towards them in full confidence. They showed no signs of stopping as they approached Alistair's army. The army retreated behind their shields, as if they were worried about being crushed by the oncoming tide. But before the armies clashed, the Fountain Legion stopped, so close that if both sides reached out their spears, the tips could touch. "Hold," Pillimore shouted. The warden who had spoken to Dervan stepped out of the formation and lowered his shield. The man didn't say or do anything, and it piqued Alistair's interest. He coaxed his horse forward, and 4 of his knights rushed to flank him. When he approached, the warden looked up. "Prince Alistair," he greeted, in a toneless voice. "Where is the Lord Warden Commander?" Alistair said, concern ringing in his voice. "My Lord Warden has remained in the capital." "You have abandoned the capital?" Alistair gasped. He summoned over Pillimore. The warden showed no reaction to this. "I am merely following the orders of my Lord Warden." "What is the word on the city?" Pillimore demanded in a quick bark. "The first wall of the city has fallen," the warden answered. "Fortune appears to be with your cause, my prince. Your General Feltor has no rival in the defense of the city." "Then who is in command of the city?" Alistair demanded. "Citadel Captain Dervan. The dictator Ignatius has been driven mad with greed and the idea of losing his power. He has imprisoned all of his generals and rivals. The high priest of the kingdom has refused his responsibility as the defender of the city. With my Lord Warden under oath to never engage in the politics of the kingdom, the captain of the Citadel Guard was the only person left. "By my father," Pillimore gasped, "the city is already ours." "Not quite," Alistair muttered, his eyes still suspicious. "Why aren't you fighting in defense of the city?" "The Fountain Legion fights on behalf of the High King," the warden spoke without any hint of vanity. "We do not fight for the politics of men. In this civil war, we are neutral." "Not fighting against us sets you on our side pretty clearly," Pillimore smirked. Alistair nodded. "Join us. Defend the realm under my banner, the future king of the realm." The warden didn't even blink. "You may have an army and place a crown on your head, but you are not the heir to the kingdom. We are joining those who can defend the realm regardless of who is king." "You will not pass here," Pillimore said, in half a splutter. "You may be brilliant in war, but we outnumber you. You will not win a battle. We are not here to fight, but if it comes to battle, we will not hold back. We have already clashed with the men of Felthor's army." "Yes, I see that," Alistair said, looking around and noting that most of the white robes were splattered with blood, and in some cases, heavy wounds that appeared to be being tended to whilst on the march. The warden continued, as if Alistair had never said anything. "They fell upon our shields, and many of their lives were lost in battle. How do you feel you will fare against us?" "Better than you," Pillimore smirked. "But how many men will you have left after the battle?" the warden threatened. "Your campaign requires you to have a full army in place. Your forces may have already prevailed in the capital, but how long will they be able to keep the kingdom in check with their depleted forces? You cannot afford battle, we can. Our sacrifice will be for the kingdom. So make your choice, prince who names himself king. Battle, or let us pass." Alistair stared. He let out a long sigh and spent a long time in silence. "Where will you go?" he managed eventually. "I am not at liberty to discuss that," the warden said. "If you hurry to the capital, perhaps you can ask my Lord Warden." Alistair let out a hiss. "Let them pass," he growled, in a voice that he had never used before. Pillimore clearly shared his anger, but uncharacteristically decided to not argue. He spat at the ground in front of the warden, and then turned his horse to order the formations. "Farewell, my prince." The warden bowed his head, as if nothing had happened. "I wish you well in your endeavours." "If we ever meet again," Alistair threatened, ignoring the politeness, "I will have your head." "No doubt you will," the warden said, not blinking. "But those who play with death should always dig 2 graves.